Hello, cohort colleagues. This video is intended to review what you learned regarding the Chapter 1 components that are required in a dissertation. So sit back and relax and enjoy this video. You'll need two resources that go along with this video because once I talk about each component of the Chapter 1, you'll want to pause the video and look at these two resources regarding that component. So the first resource, of course, is your text, the L&I text, and you'll want to have your book open to Chapter 6 that talks about all of the required components and even gives examples of each of those components that are necessary for Chapter 1. The other resource that you'll want to have available is the actual example student paper itself. Remember, we learned about a component, and then we went to this example paper to see what that component actually looks like. So make sure that you have a printed copy of this available would be the most ideal. So those are the two resources that you'll need to use to accompany this video. So I hope you have a cup of coffee. I do. And let's learn about Chapter 1. For Chapter 1, it is the chapter of a dissertation that has more major headings to write about than any other chapter. In fact, it has 11 required components. But the good news about Chapter 1 is that many are only 1 to 3 paragraphs long. For instance, statement of the problem could be just that, one statement to the problem that you've identified. So that's the good news. It's not nearly as lengthy as a Chapter 2 in a dissertation. If you remember, a real dissertation with a Chapter 2 is a minimum of 35 pages. It doesn't include the annotated bibliography. You're just doing that for this particular course. But a Chapter 2 is very extensive narrative of the literature that you review on your topic. Chapter 1 is only about 10 pages or so. Sometimes it's even 7 to 10 pages. I think in your example paper you'll see that it's around 10 pages. Yours may not be as long as this example paper. So I think you'll enjoy writing Chapter 1 because you have better background knowledge about your topic since you've done your Chapter 2 mini kind of lit review in terms of an annotated bibliography where you reviewed at least 25 of those 35 references. So you've got some background knowledge on your topic now, which will make it easier to write Chapter 1. And when I chair students' dissertation committees, I always tell them to start with Chapter 2 first because you've built that background knowledge and now you can write Chapter 1. So it makes it a lot more fun. So let's go to the first component, and I'm going to try to turn off the camera. And the first component is the background of the study. And that is simply to get your reader hooked to your topic. It gets the reader acquainted with your topic and your research. It states why you're investigating this area, and it really suggests that really the reason you're doing this study is because it's a challenging issue that has been unresolved, it's been under-investigated or under-researched, or just unexplored issues exist with this topic. So take that example student paper and read the example in there. I think it begins on page 6. And see what the background of the study actually looks like in a sample dissertation. I also would like you to refer to your Chapter 6 in your book, and you'll see that on page 113, it begins talking about the background of the study. It also talks about all of the components that are required in your Chapter 1. What I like about this book, you'll read information about what a background of the study is, and then it also gives you another sample of what a background of the study looks like. And remember, it could include in-text citations We talked about your Chapter 1 needing in-text citations. It's not about your opinion when you're writing this introduction in the background of the study. It's not about your experience, although we know you are a very informed school practitioner. But what you write about is based on the research that you have found. Again, not your opinion or not your experience. So I'm going to be looking for that throughout your Chapter 1, that you include paraphrased material cited by a source, which is called an in-text citation within the body of your paper. And you need to make sure that that source is listed on your references page. If you have found an additional source that needs to be included in your background of the study that wasn't included on your original references page, add it to your references. Because we double check that any in-text citations that's cited within the body of your paper is included on your references page. So take time, pause the video, look at the two sources, and review background of the study so that you can see what that looks like. Now that you've had a chance to review the background of the study, let's move on to the second component of a Chapter 1, and that is the statement of the problem. It's a problem. It's a challenge or an issue around your topic. So your statement can be 1 or 2 sentences. I think your example paper is a lot longer, and we discussed the other night that it really didn't need to be that long. But you're kind of answering the question when you write about the statement of the problem. Why does someone need to research the phenomenon identified in the background of the study that you just talked about? The statement of the problem clarifies what part of the issue you propose to investigate. It's important to remember that with the statement of the problem you write about in Chapter 1, it could change as you get further into the dissertation writing process. So you're writing it for now, but then later you might revisit the statement of the problem. For example, when you get ready to write Chapter 3 for this course, you may realize that your statement of the problem needs to be tweaked a little bit or needs to be changed. So it's always an evolving process, and change isn't bad. We just need to make sure that everything is aligned to Chapter 1, Chapter 2, and Chapter 3. So take time to look at the statement of the problem in your L&I text, look at the example that they give, and then go to the example paper. And I believe the statement of the problem is discussed on pages 8 and 9. Again, in this example paper, the statement of the problem is a little lengthy, so give yourself some freedom to shorten your statement of the problem up just a little bit. Here's additional information on statement of the problem, and it is important. It is your problem. When you review and pause the video, see if you can identify which of these reasons those statement of the problems happen to be getting at. Is it because, did they say that there was little or no existing research? Or did they say it was because just some research exists, but it hasn't been replicated enough times to be considered reliable? Or is it because there's lots of research on the topic, however, there's contradictory research? So this researcher says one thing, and then several other researchers say the opposite. That could be a reason for a problem that exists. Or it could be that multiple theories explain the same phenomenon, but the outcomes are different for each. So think about that as you review the statement of the problem in the book, as well as in the example paper, and think about your own statement of the problem based around your topic, and which of these 4 reasons does your problem fit. The next component, the third component of a chapter 1, is the purpose of the study. So, a lot of people think that the statement of the problem and the purpose is different, but it's the same, but they really are slightly different. They're similar. But the purpose of the study is, how are you proposing to provide at least some clarity to this problem? That might include some variables you identify, your intent, or some unit of analysis. The purpose of the study doesn't have to be lengthy. And again, look in your L&I text. It gives a nice reason for purpose of the study and why you write a purpose of the study. Gives an example. And then also go to the example student paper on page 9. You'll see that the purpose of their study was really written very short, so this does not have to be a lengthy section. Let's move on to the significance of the study. The significance is, why is the research you propose worth doing? Again, will it create new knowledge? Will it have a theoretical or practical application? And I like to always ask students, what benefit is your research going to be for the field of education? Is it going to be beneficial for teachers to review, for administrators, for individual schools to take a look at your research, or maybe your research needs to be looked at a broader scale at the district level? So it might prove worthy for school districts or superintendents to look at your research, or just all superintendents in Missouri. So why is your research important and worth doing? You can look at significance of the study. Again, pause the video, see what that looks like in your text, and see what that looks like in the sample paper. And that begins on page 9, and I think goes into a little bit of page 10. The next section or component is, you need to define key terms, and that's called definitions of terms. So your definition of terms are listed alphabetically. They're intended to minimize any ambiguity about your definitions. In other words, to kind of develop common understanding, so everybody's clear about these definitions. You can include key terms from your research questions in Me. For example, I know we've got one person at least doing a study on leader in Me. So you would want to define, I think that course leader in Me would be in your research question, and you would need to define what leader in Me is. You'll need to cite those definitions, where you got those definitions developed by others. Your definitions can be provided to clarify any positions, titles. For instance, my position in Columbia Public Schools when I was in central office was Director of School Improvement. Wow, what does that title mean? And often I would get that question. So if you're doing, a study on something where directors of school improvement are involved, you would need to define that title and clarify what that position title means. When you go to your example paper on page 10 and look at those definitions, you'll see that they are capitalized and they are in bold. And they're followed by a period. And then you start the definition in the same line after the period. So follow that format on the dissertation template, and you can see an example of that in your example paper. And you'll notice that the definitions of terms are, she had quite a few, pages 10, 11, 12. You may not have that many definition of terms, and that's okay, but simply notice also that she has cited where she retrieved those dissertations. So make sure you give credit to the sources there under your definition of terms. Your book also gives good examples of the purpose of definition of terms. And here's another slide that talks about it. This is important too because sometimes you need to define what you are going to measure. And here's an example, student achievement. Well, for purposes of this study, that's how you would start your definition of term for student achievement. For purposes of this study, student achievement is defined, let's see if it's talked about in here. It's talked about on page 12 in the example paper. For purposes of this study, to demonstrate proficiency and mastery of skills within a content area, i.e. reading, math, etc. So you may need to define, if you're using in your study a measure of ACT, you'll have to say, for purposes of this study, student achievement is defined by results on the ACT as examined by the researcher through the composite score and individual content level scores. The next section that we need to talk about is a theoretical framework. First of all, I would like to say that a theoretical framework is not required for purposes of this assignment. However, when you get assigned your chair, they may want you to put in a theoretical framework. And it's not, again, required for this assignment. But this is a concept that together explains patterns you wish to study. And we used the other night the example of John Hattie's work with visible learners and those effective strategies that have been proven through many meta-analysis studies that are effective strategies to use in the classroom. Such a researcher could be used as your theoretical framework. So think about that, not real hard during this course, but I really do believe that studies that have theoretical frameworks bring lots of power to your study and validity and reliability because you're referencing a theory. And so that might be something that you want to consider. You can look at a theoretical framework as defined in the LNI text, and you can see some examples of a theoretical framework. If you go to the example paper on page 12, you'll see that there is no theoretical framework. The next component is very important, and you've already had some experience with this in your Chapter 2, but it's asking you to identify your research questions. And so you can simply take your research questions that you developed in Chapter 2 and you can move them to Chapter 1. However, as you know, research questions can change. We've talked about that. We even had the other week a student where their research question was reduced from 2 to 1 when they were defending their dissertation. So it can change anywhere throughout the process. I may, on your Chapter 2 assignment, give you some suggestions for changing your research question because I get the feeling, or I have the feeling, that your research could maybe developing into a quantitative study, but you've chosen you've had a mismatch of research questions to a quantitative study. In other words, your research questions might be more qualitative when your study is lending itself to a more quantitative dissertation. If you remember, research questions that ask the what, how, or why are qualitative questions. They're open-ended questions to get at the thick descriptions that you're capturing from your participants through interviews or focus groups. Or you may be asking more quantitative questions. So are you asking about relationships among or between variables? Those are questions that are more quantitative. So go to your LNI text and look at that section that talks about in Chapter 6 your research questions. It gives a good example of qualitative research questions and quantitative research questions if you need to review that. Or if you need to go back to your qualitative source, the Hesse-Biber source that you just used in your qualitative class has good examples of qualitative research questions, or you may need to go to your quantitative source that you had in your quantitative class. If you look at page 12 in the example pages, or example paper, excuse me, you'll see the research questions are listed on page 13. This section, she had 2 quantitative questions, and she mentioned the null hypotheses for this study was stated as follows. So you may want to include that as a part of your research question. Underneath your research questions, you can certainly provide that information. I see that in some dissertations. I don't see it in all dissertations. Here's some more information about research questions. They address the issues that you raise in your purpose of the study. So make sure your research questions are aligned to your purpose of the study all throughout Chapter 1. Also, your statement of the problem and including your background of the study. Make sure that all of that is in alignment to your research question. It's important to remember that well-constructed questions are singular in purpose and contain only one unit of analysis, one action, one object of the action. For example, if you are using reading, let's say MAP, 3rd grade reading scores, that's in its own research question. If you are also, in addition, looking at some relationship to MAP 3rd grade math scores, that's a second research question. So it's one unit of analysis in each of those questions. In fact, going back to page 13 of the sample paper, we noticed that the first research question at the top of page 13, she combined reading and math together, and that's not what you want to do. She needs to separate out those two areas of reading and math scores into 2 different research questions. So that's a non-exemplar example. The next section are delimitations. These are boundaries that you as a researcher set on the study, and you can see examples of limitations in the example paper on page 14. Here are some examples of delimitations. For instance, you as a researcher decide that you're going to include public schools but not private schools in your example, in your study. Same thing. You as a researcher may decide that you're going to limit your research to just rural schools in Missouri and you're going to exclude urban schools. Or you as a researcher, you're only going to include grades 3 through 5 in your study. You're not going to include grades K1 and 2 or middle school or high school. So you define those delimitations. It might be too that you're only going to look at certain years or specific tests. So while ACT and EOC exams are taken by all juniors, you've chosen just to use the ACT as a unit of measure, and this is the reason why. Or you may just include the years 2013 to 2016 with ACT because in the 17-18 school year, the requirement for juniors to take the ACT, all juniors in the state to take the ACT, was dropped by DESE. So these are the delimitations, the limitations that you set, you decide as a researcher. So look at those delimitations on page 14 in the example paper and read about that in your L&I text and look at those examples. Now let's talk about limitations. This is where you're going to summarize why your findings cannot be applied to other populations. And you're going to go back and review your limitations after your entire dissertation is finished, because your limitations, all of a sudden, another limitation may have popped up as a result of you doing your research. So you'll need to revisit that. Examples of limitations include distribution of research participants not deliberately planned. So maybe DESE decides to only give this assessment at certain grade levels, and you can't do your measurement with other grade levels because that assessment is not given at that grade level. That could be a limitation. Or gender is not provided by DESE. That's a limitation. So there's various reasons for limitations. So look at those examples on page 13 in the example paper, and then review the examples in your L&I text. Another required component of Chapter 1 are assumptions. And I think this will be pretty clear to you as you look at the assumptions on page 14 and 15 of the example paper, and you review what assumptions are in your text. But examples of assumptions could be, let's say that you've given a survey. So those who participate in your research did so willingly. You're assuming that they were honest in answering those questions and they participated willingly, and that they understood the survey that you gave them. So assumptions are pretty clear-cut. The last component of Chapter 1 is simply how are you organizing your Chapter 1, and briefly what the other chapters in your dissertation will include. Chapters 2, Chapters 3, Chapter 4. So look at the example in your L&I text, example 6.16 on page 136, and you'll see what an organization of the study looks like. It's not long. You'll see it on page 15. It's quite simple for you to write, and they're very similar across all dissertations because you're simply explaining how your study is organized. So these are the references that we used to develop this PowerPoint, and that's our video for Chapter 1. And I hope this has helped you get a clearer understanding of what's required in Chapter 1. So go forth and enjoy writing. Thank you very much.